There's a doctrine we may run into when we encounter Buddhism, the Buddha Dharma, that things exist for a moment, a very, very short period of time, maybe even an instant, and then they are replaced. They disappear and are replaced by very similar objects that are different by a process of causation, a sort of causal process. This idea that things persist for a moment, sometimes we will have heard the term mind moments, for example. This doctrine of what we know as momentariness is sometimes gotten across to us as something that goes back to the earliest moments of Buddhism, that it comes from the Buddha. However, as we'll see, that actually is not the case. This is a later doctrine, this doctrine of momentariness, and that's what we're going to discuss in today's video. So first, what I'm going to do is to look at what the Buddha had to say. Then I'll turn to some early developments in Theravada Buddhism in particular, which is the one sort of school that's particularly old in terms of what it has to say. It goes back quite a long ways, or at least some of the doctrines of the Theravada go back quite a long ways. And then I'll turn to developments in other early schools of Buddhism, so we can see some comparisons. So in the words of Alexander von Rospat, there can be no doubt that the theory of momentariness cannot be traced back to the beginnings of Buddhism, or even the Buddha himself. And von Rospat's book, The Buddhist Doctrine of Momentariness, is what I'm going to be relying upon for a good portion of what I'll be talking about in today's video. His book is probably the deepest and most extensive treatment of this doctrine that we have in scholarship. Now, I certainly won't be able to touch on anywhere close to all of what he talks about in the book. If you're interested, I'll leave a link to the book down below in the notes if you want to take a look at it. So to begin with, what is the doctrine that we might say of change that we find in the early suttas? Or the doctrine we might say of moments, so to speak? Well, the doctrine of change, of moments, if you like, is, I would say, pragmatic and fluid. All things change. That is certainly something that goes back to the earliest parts of the Dharma. But the nature of that change is not elaborated upon. In particular, there is unproblematic talk about things persisting through a certain amount of change. Not for enormous periods of time, but certainly persistence is discussed in the early suttas. In one example, we have a discussion where the Buddha asks, who is capable of greater pleasure, himself or King Bimbisara? Now, you might think that King Bimbisara would be capable of greater pleasures because he's a king. He can afford to pay anything, basically, in the coin of the realm of the day, in order to gain any kind of sense pleasures he might want. But the Buddha says that's not the case. And in fact, what he says is this: I am capable of experiencing perfect happiness for one day and night without moving my body or speaking. I'm capable of experience perfect happiness for 2 days, for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days. So what the Buddha is saying here is that he can remain in absorptive meditation for an extended period of time without any alteration. This is a kind of pleasure that is, first of all, deeper, the Buddha says, deeper than, or more profound, greater than sense pleasures, but it's also more stable and durable than sense pleasures. Whereas sense pleasures come and go very quickly, we get over them, we tend to get over them in a matter of minutes. These kinds of deep, absorptive, meditative pleasures we can persist in for significant periods of time, up to, the Buddha says, even a week in a row, which seems quite a lot actually, but in any event, that's what he says. And even in other passages where the Buddha discusses change, it's discussed at times apparently happening to a persisting thing, something that persists for at least a period of time. Here's one example. That which is called mind or sentience or consciousness arises as one thing and ceases as another by day and by night. It's like a monkey moving through the forest. it grabs hold of one branch, lets it go, and grabs another. Then it lets that go and grabs yet another. Now, in this passage, we naturally focus on the metaphor of the different branches that the monkey grasps, that monkey mind, if you like, but that misses the persisting monkey throughout, which is this mind that seems to persist through the grabbing of various branches. Now, none of this is to claim that the Buddha believed that there was a permanently persisting mind throughout all of life or something like that. Of course, he did not believe such a thing. But it leaves the character of that persistence fluid, undetermined. Persistence for the Buddha occurred over a period of time that was unspecified and then therefore potentially variable. So in other words, there wasn't a particular moment in time that something persisted for, it persisted for a period of time. Again, unspecified. The Buddha never mentioned things like mind moments. And according to von Rospat, there are few, if any, mentions of this doctrine in the Abhidharmas of the various schools. Now, the Abhidharmas, I can't go into it in a great deal of detail, but the Abhidharma was a process by which the people after the Buddha's lifetime tried to organize the Buddha's Dharma into a more digestible form, a more rigorous, structured form. And with the rising of the Abhidharma, we got more sort of a scholastic or directly philosophical kind of interpretation of the Dharma, because instead of trying to find the answer to various questions by looking at all these different suttas where the Buddha discussed one thing and another, instead it was all sort of compiled in one place. So in any event, according to von Rospat, this doctrine of momentariness is virtually not discussed in the Abhidharma, here and there in mentions, but not in any detail. As a result, von Rospat believes that this doctrine of momentariness actually arose basically in the post-Abhidharma period, perhaps in the 1st century BCE or thereafter. Now, when we talk about the early development of this doctrine in the Theravada school in particular, Bhikkhu Sujato notes in an online post, and I'll leave a link to that down below in the notes, Bhikkhu Sujato, who's a scholar of early Buddhism, very interested in this topic, notes that you do find mentions of the doctrine of momentariness in some late canonical texts. The late sort of Abhidharma texts, such as the Points of Controversy, which is a famous text in the Theravada tradition, the Questions of King Milinda, as well as the Commentarial and Nidesa. So in a few different places. However, if we're looking at the Points of Controversy in particular, which again is a minor book in the Theravada Abhidharma, the doctrine of momentariness only comes up as kind of a footnote, basically, simply rejecting the idea that material objects existed only for one moment. So again, it's sort of like a footnote. There's no kind of extended treatment of this doctrine. And in fact, this book, The Points of Controversy, is, as the title might suggest, a very sectarian work in the Theravada tradition. It's a book that exists to attempt to refute the positions of different other schools of Buddhism, basically argue or at least claim that these other views of alternate schools are incorrect. So, as we might expect, what we find in this period, that late Abhidharma or post-Abhidharma period, is sectarianism. This is the period at which the different schools of Buddhism were separating from one another, with different interpretations of the Dharma. Indeed, the development of the Abhidharma itself occurred in just that place, which is why the different schools of Buddhism have different Abhidharmas. Of course, there are similarities in many respects between them, but there are also significant differences, because each school, isolated in its own part of the world, of India in particular, had different ways of organizing and collating and understanding the suttas and the Dharma of the suttas. And in particular, many of these schools had disagreements and disputes about how to structure this idea, this relatively new idea of momentariness, what it might mean, how it might be cashed out, as it were, in Dharmic terms. Indeed, von Rothbard's view is the doctrine of momentariness probably arose outside of the mainstream Abhidharmic traditions. He says this because, as I've just been discussing, we don't find a lot of discussions of this doctrine in the Abhidharmas. It's just sort of mentioned here and there, which suggests that it was in the air, it was around, people were talking about it, but it was not mainstream. It was something that was in the air, in discussions, in arguments, people weren't agreeing with one another, but it wasn't developed enough for it to become integrated into the various Abhidharmas. This, again, it occurred later. So the upshot is that the development of the true doctrine of momentariness was, we might say, basically post-canonical, that is to say, after the organization of what we might consider the canons of each school, and was also basically a sectarian doctrine. That is, there were significant differences between the different schools. Basically, after the elaboration of each school's Abhidharma, then these doctrines of momentariness arose as independent ways to understand this change that was so fundamental to the Buddhist Dharma. For example, to take one school, the Mahasangikas, which is a school that people believe into which, I should say, out of which people believe the Mahayana basically arose. But the Mahasangikas seem to have taken that the doctrine of momentariness really only applied to mental things, to mental states, whereas physical or material things might have persisted for significantly more longer periods of time than the mental ones did. Now, when I'm discussing these various schools, I'll mention one or two of them, not in a lot of detail, and I wouldn't worry too much about the various names of these schools and what they believed. The fact is, when you begin to look into the various early schools of Buddhism, the differences between them are very, really minor and esoteric and we might say somewhat scholastic. And getting into the exact differences is not the point here. Rather, what I want to raise in this video is simply that the doctrine of momentariness was not a fixed thing in Buddhism, but was something that was being contested. In any event, a different school, the Dharmaguptakas, seem to have believed that some mental entities could actually last a long time. I've just already mentioned here about the Buddha remaining for 7 days in deep samadhi. Well, that's an example where a mental, we might say, that here is a mental event that could last for 7 days. So again, differences of opinion here. Now, in the more developed Theravada, in particular in Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga, which is a 5th century of the Common Era text, a good 1,000 years after the Buddha's lifetime, we find quite a detailed elaboration of this doctrine of momentariness, whereby 17 mental events occur in the time of one physical or material event. And this is a very detailed and precise kind of account of the doctrine of momentariness, where a certain causal stream of 17 in particular occur per material event. Now, this is quite a surprising kind of claim, I think, and one that is specific to the Theravadan tradition in particular. We don't exactly know how this tradition developed. It seems to have developed as, we believe, basically everything in the Visuddhimagga did, by a long commentarial tradition, which is probably lost at this point. But this doctrine of momentariness, whereby 17 mental events occurs in the space of time of one material event, again became part of Theravadan orthodoxy. And the justification, the pithy justification that Buddhaghosa gives for this claim is this very short sentence in the Suttas, where the Buddha says, "Mendicants, I do not see a single thing that's as quick to change as the mind." So this would seem to establish that the mind changes faster than material things. That's how, for example, the commentary to this particular passage takes it. There are commentaries to all of the suttas in the Theravadan tradition, and there's a particular commentary to this particular passage, and it raises this issue of these mind moments. However, in a footnote, Bhikkhu Bodhi, who is a contemporary translator and scholar, notes that actually also in the Vinaya, which is the rule book, the sort of monastic rule book, it also mentions this particular claim of the Buddhas that nothing changes faster than the mind, but takes it in a completely different way. It takes it to mean that the mind can change. One can literally change one's mind very rapidly, as fast as faster than anything else. In particular, that this refers to the quickness with which a monk can decide to disrobe. That a monk might go into the village and see, that is, a male monk might go into a village and see, let's say, a beautiful woman and decide to disrobe in an instant, very quickly. And so that's the kind of, at least according to Vinaya, that's the correct way to take this particular claim of the Buddhas, and not some more esoteric claim about mental moments being sort of more rapid than material ones. There's also a very interesting commentarial claim or discussion of the passage I just read about this monkey flitting from branch to branch, or actually about the sentence just prior to it. If you'll recall, that which is called mind or sentience or consciousness arises as one thing and ceases as another by day and by night. So the commentary to this particular passage takes great pains to sort of disabuse us of the illusion that a mental state could actually persist for an entire day or an entire night, again, as also we might have assumed from the earlier passage about the Buddha remaining in deep samadhi for 7 days. According to the commentarial tradition, that's simply a manner of speaking and should not be taken literally. In fact, the commentary says this: even in the time of a finger snap, many hundred thousands of 10 millions, which if you do the math ends up as trillions, many trillions of mental states arise and cease. Now it's hard to know what to make of such claims, that trillions of mental states appear and disappear in a finger snap. Contemporary experiments have determined that conscious resolution, or conscious perception, I should say, has a resolution of something around 40 milliseconds, in the sense that any two events of closer than 40 milliseconds apart appear to us to be simultaneous. Now, it may be that trained meditators or athletes may be able to minimize that even a little bit more, but certainly nowhere near enough to be able to verify that trillions of mental events occur in the space of a finger snap. So where this claim comes from, I don't think it could ever come from actual introspection. That said, these claims about 40 millisecond mental resolution or perceptual resolution does seem to give some weight to the general idea of momentariness, in the sense that there's a limit to how close things can be before we cease seeing them as separate. That there's a limit to how closely we can cut time, at least in terms of our own phenomenology of time, if you like. That is, the doctrine of momentariness makes sense from a sort of psychologically oriented interpretation of time. For another early school, the Sarvastivadins, they seem to have believed that this minimal time was somewhere around 0.13 to 13 milliseconds, depending on how you cut these things. I'm relying upon a recent article to get that number. I'm not sure exactly where they get it, but at least that's the claim, which at least gets close to the 40 milliseconds that we seem to have verified scientifically recently. The Sarvastivadins believe that both mental and physical events had the same kinds of properties and qualities. Both of them contained 4 elements: an element of arising, persistence, transformation, and destruction. The question for other schools was how all of these four things could be occurring simultaneously in the same event. How could a rising and destruction be occurring at the same time as persistence and all the rest, and each other? So it seems as though, from a Sarvastivadin perspective, that each of these moments actually encompassed a period of time in which there was a beginning and an end, which strangely makes it no longer a sort of a single moment, a singular thing, an atomic sort of thing, but rather something with persistence. Again, which is something that seems somewhat questionable to other schools of Buddhism. I do want to note in passing that this notion of momentariness of time is really radically different from the conception of time we get from contemporary physics, for example. There, time is considered along a continuum, like the three dimensions of space. The dimension of time is simply a continuum. It's potentially infinitely divisible. There's no smallest moment of time, except perhaps what's known as the Planck length in quantum mechanics. But the distance of the Planck length in time, Planck time, is roughly speaking 5 × 10⁻⁴ seconds, which is a dot and 44 seconds and a 5. So we're talking a distance in time that is even many, many orders of magnitude smaller than the Theravadins would have anticipated. So to sum up, this idea of time as momentary, where things were literally every moment being arising and decaying and being replaced by similar but slightly different things that arose and decayed in a moment, both within the mind and within physical things, this idea arose not with the Buddha, but in the centuries after the Buddha, indeed in the late Abhidharmic and post-Abhidharmic periods, potentially 400, 500 years after the Buddha's lifetime, in different ways in different Buddhist schools, as kind of sectarian interpretations of the Buddha's earlier message. The Buddha's earlier message, however, was much more pragmatic, much more fluid, a pragmatic, fluid, somewhat undetermined notion of change and time that allowed for change over potentially various periods of time that were, again, undetermined and unspoken. Now, the general idea of time is a strange one when we look at it in Buddhism, but also when we look at it in general, in sort of a philosophical sense. I did an earlier video about that very topic, which was probably not very much seen at the time, but I think is a good one, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.